The midsummer of 1944 brought a relentless, suffocating heat to the American Southwest. Across the barren scrubland of Texas, the air itself seemed to buckle, shimmering like liquid metal above the endless stretches of barbed wire. For the German prisoners of war, the journey ended not with a victory march, but with a terrifying shriek of steel brakes against the rails, a violent jolt that signaled the final stop for the prison transport train. Inside the suffocating confines of the cattle car, the atmosphere was thick with the stench of sweat, diesel, and fear. 42 German prisoners, packed shoulder to shoulder, had endured the grueling 3-day transport from the East Coast Processing Center. Through the narrow wooden slats, Captain Klaus Weber caught glimpses of American guards in khaki uniforms, rifles slung across their shoulders, their faces appearing as hard and unforgiving as the desert stone beneath their boots. Weber's stoicism was hard-won, forged in the frigid depths of the Atlantic, where he had watched his U-boat crew drown. He pulled his father's brass compass from his breast pocket, checking it obsessively. The familiar weight of glass and metal offered a small, grounding anchor in the chaos. He leaned closer to Hans Mueller. The 19-year-old radio man pressed against his side. "Remember," he hissed in German, his voice low and firm. "Name, rank, serial number. Nothing more." Mueller, still exhibiting the soft features of youth, swallowed hard, his atoms apple-bobbing. His inexperience was a vulnerability Weber had tried to shield during the crossing, sharing meager rations when the boy succumbed to sickness. Now, protection was about to become infinitely more complicated. The journey's end was heralded by a deafening metallic crash as the door burst open. Blinding sunlight flooded the darkness, momentarily overwhelming the prisoners, who raised shackled wrists to shield their eyes. American voices barked orders in a harsh English that Weber only partially understood, but the universal language of rifle barrels pointing directly at them required no translation. "Raus! Raus!" shouted a guard who had clearly mastered enough German to efficiently move the human cargo. "Out! Move!" Weber, bracing himself for the anticipated brutality fueled by Reich propaganda, was among the first forced onto the scorching ground, his legs unsteady after days of confinement. But the expected violence never materialized. Instead, Camp Commander Mitchell approached, not with a standard weapon, but with an utterly unexpected offering, a Cuban cigar. A premium Monte Cristo, a luxury few of Weber's own high command could genuinely afford. Weber stared at the expensive tobacco, the shackles cutting into his wrists, his hands trembling slightly. "This is trick," he managed in broken English. Mitchell simply lit his own cigar, the smoke curling lazily in the Texas air, and offered a cold smile. "No trick," he replied, "just rules." Yet, as Captain Weber would soon realize, nothing in this remote Texas prison camp, not the kindness, not the cigars, and certainly not the truth about why they were receiving such luxuries, was what it seemed. The brutal, dry heat of the Texas desert was an immediate physical shock, a searing contrast to the constant, damp chill of the North Atlantic that had defined his recent existence. Beneath the blazing afternoon sun, the ground was unforgiving hard-packed earth and gravel, sealed off by double rows of silvered barbed wire. Guard towers stood sentinel at every corner, their shadows the only respite from the relentless sky. As the prisoners were organized into ragged lines, American soldiers, using strong but measured force, guided them toward a cluster of wooden buildings. This sight contradicted the darkest propaganda clouds had been fed by the SS. Tales of immediate, brutal confinement and disappearance into smoke and silence. Instead, he observed functional latrines, barracks equipped with actual windows, and the crisp, unfamiliar geometry of the American flag snapping above the compound. From the Central Administration Building, Camp Commander John Mitchell emerged. His uniform remained impeccably pressed despite the oppressive conditions, his bearing erect but devoid of swagger. He was a man clearly seasoned by command, perhaps 45, with lines of fatigue around his eyes and gray threading through his dark hair, the visual signature of difficult wartime responsibilities. Mitchell approached the assembly and began speaking in deliberate, carefully enunciated German, his accent thick but his intent unmistakable. Consulting a small notebook, he laid out the rules of their new reality. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention," Mitchell stated firmly. "You are prisoners, not animals. You will receive food, medical care, and the opportunity to contact families through the Red Cross. Klaus scrutinized the commander's face, searching for the inherent cruelty he had been conditioned to expect from American captors. Yet, Mitchell displayed a profound, disquieting calm, a steady tone of professional adherence to rules, devoid of personal hatred or triumph. That evening, lying on his assigned bunk in Barrack C, Klaus studied the unfamiliar constellation patterns visible through the window. The fragile peace was broken by the appearance of a young guard, perhaps 22, whose nervous energy and farm boy freckles belied the seriousness of his duty. "Weber, Klaus?" the guard inquired, checking a clipboard. Still stiff from transport, Klaus sat up slowly. "The commander requires your presence immediately." The walk to Mitchell's office became an anxious procession. His wooden shoes echoed against the plank walkway, while other prisoners watched from windows, their faces reflecting the same churning question. Was this the point where the American mask of civility would finally drop? Mitchell's office was Spartan, yet meticulously maintained. Maps of the vast Texas landscape covered one wall, and a small radio softly crackled with the unfamiliar rhythms of American jazz. The commander sat behind a simple desk, but Klaus's attention was drawn to a rich mahogany box beside a stack of papers. A cigar humidor. Mitchell addressed him. "Your submarine records indicate you served as navigator." He repeated the key phrase in broken German. "I need men who can read maps for work details." Klaus remained rigidly at attention. Mitchell then performed an extraordinary gesture. He opened the humidor and withdrew 2 cigars. Cuban Monte Cristos. This was a luxury Klaus knew well, a wartime extravagance rarely afforded even by senior German officers. Mitchell extended the premium cigar toward Klaus, an act of calculated familiarity that masked the rigid boundaries of captor and prisoner. Klaus stared at the Monte Cristo, the unlit tobacco representing a psychological snare. "This is, how you say, a trick," his internal monologue cautioned. Mitchell, meanwhile, performed the ritual of lighting his own, the match flare briefly illuminating the chiseled contours of his weathered face before he drew deeply and exhaled a deliberate plume of smoke. Meeting Klaus's gaze with unsettling directness, Mitchell offered a simple explanation. No trick, just the established rules. But as Klaus returned to the barracks, the coveted Cuban cigar clutched tightly in his hand, an unread message of misplaced expectation. He passed 2 guards sharing a cigarette near the supply depot. Their low voices cut through the stillness of the Texas night. "Give them the good stuff first," one guard chuckled. "Softens them up for later." The casual cruelty of the remark struck Klaus with the force of shrapnel. Any nascent flicker of trust in American decency, any belief in protections afforded by the Geneva Convention, instantly withered. It was replaced by the familiar, cold armor of suspicion, a survival mechanism honed over 4 years of intensive warfare. Everything he had begun to contemplate regarding fairness or dignity in captivity dissolved. It was all, he concluded, merely sophisticated propaganda utilized by both sides. 3 days later, just after dawn, the intense Texas heat still held at bay. The promised work commenced. Klaus was assigned to a specialized detail, mapping intricate irrigation channels vital for local cotton farms. His advanced navigational expertise, a skill once dedicated to sinking Allied vessels, had apparently earned him a reprieve from the camp's more punitive labor assignments. Working alongside 5 other prisoners, including Hans, he spread topographical charts across rough-hewn tables sheltered by a canvas awning, while American guards maintained a respectful, yet watchful, distance. Klaus had fully anticipated a cruel joke, privilege disguised as punishment, yet the reality proved deeply unsettling. This was genuine, demanding work, the precise, methodical plotting he had once executed aboard his U-boat, charting courses through lethal, treacherous waters. The profound irony was inescapable. His talent for plotting destruction was now channeled toward sustaining life, bringing water to the very crops that would feed his declared enemies. Commander Mitchell maintained a regular presence at the worksite, sometimes delivering updated elevation data, often simply observing with the quiet intensity of a man who valued meticulous precision. The topic of the Cuban cigars was never revisited. However, Klaus noticed that Mitchell frequently consulted a small, brass and glass compass, an instrument remarkably similar to one his own father had carried. consulting it with an obsessive frequency Klaus recognized in himself. "You were a rancher?" Klaus inquired one morning, his functional English improving daily through necessity and Mitchell's patient corrections. He gestured toward the detailed way Mitchell studied the proposed water routes, a familiarity that transcended standard military engineering. Mitchell nodded, his gaze fixed on the map spread between them. "Before the war, mostly cattle, some cotton. Water is life out here. I believe you understand this," he remarked, tracing a path for a new channel. "Navigation at sea. You know what it means when resources are limited." The comparison was sudden and profound. Klaus had never linked the stringent rationing of fresh water on a submarine to the delicate balance of managing arid land irrigation, yet the foundational principle was identical. Waste invited failure. Careful planning guaranteed survival. For the first time, weeks into his captivity, a profound shift had occurred in Klaus's rigid worldview. He found himself developing something akin to professional respect for the camp's American commander, Mitchell, an acknowledgement of shared discipline across enemy lines. The catalyst arrived on a humid Wednesday in August. It was delivered by Sofia Martinez, the Red Cross volunteer whose presence had become a quiet constant within the compound. Martinez was a small woman defined by dark, knowing eyes and the callous hands of someone accustomed to physical labor. She navigated the barracks with the quiet, practiced efficiency of an individual equally comfortable bridging multiple linguistic and cultural divides, translating German letters, and offering Spanish solace to homesick prisoners who reminded her of her own brothers. "From Germany," she stated simply, extending an envelope that bore the visible wear of transatlantic travel. "From Anna Weber." Klaus's composure fractured instantly. His hands trembled as he accepted the missive, his fingers tracing the familiar script that had served as his sole tether to sanity during the claustrophobic eternity beneath the ocean. Anna's letters were his anchor, representing the possibility that life, untainted by war, death, or the endless gray of submarine corridors, might still endure. He absorbed the contents 3 times before the magnitude of the news fully registered. Anna was alive, though the devastating aerial campaign against Hamburg had obliterated their neighborhood, their church, and the small cafe where they had shared their first cup of real coffee. Anna had survived the inferno. She was now resettled in the countryside with her sister, engaged in the arduous work of the harvest, attempting to reconstruct meaning from the ruins of their former existence. That evening, Commander Mitchell appeared at Klaus's bunk, the polished wooden humidor tucked beneath his arm. Without preamble, he placed a box on the small, scarred table. He withdrew 2 Monte Cristos, mirroring the unspoken ritual established weeks earlier. Mitchell offered one to Klaus, his gaze steady. "Good news, I think," he inquired softly, nodding toward the carefully folded letter Klaus still clutched. This time, Klaus accepted the cigar without hesitation, recognizing it not as a calculated maneuver of psychological warfare, but as an offering of simple, shared humanity. "Yes," he replied, struggling to find precise English translation. "Good news. She lives. My Anna lives." Mitchell produced a worn silver lighter, a tool that seemed to carry the weight of decades, and carefully lit both cigars. The rich, aromatic smoke ascended slowly into the humid evening air, carrying a sense of luxury Klaus had almost forgotten existed, a pleasure purely for its own sake, devoid of strategic purpose. Drawn by the unusual spectacle of their most cautious comrade smoking alongside the camp commander, other prisoners began to gather. Hans, still young and grappling with the moral complexities of a world where enemies extended kindness, approached tentatively. Mitchell reached back into the humidor and withdrew enough cigars for the small, silent group. One by one, he lit each Monte Cristo with the same careful, deliberate attention. The flicker of the flame cast a warm, transient light across faces that had long been hardened by expectation of cruelty, but were now slowly relearning the possibility of compassion. Nearby, a portable radio sputtered to life, filling the compound with the joyous, complex strains of Benny Goodman's clarinet, weaving through sing, sing, sing. The sound instantly transported Klaus, making him envision Anna dancing exuberantly in their tiny Hamburg apartment. The music filled the quiet spaces between their conversation, creating a moment Klaus had not experienced since the war began, a pure, untainted space existing outside the constant, exhausting calculation of strategy and survival. This music, Klaus murmured, narrator, grave, measured tone. The shared ritual of the Cuban cigar provided a strange counterpoint to the ideological war that had defined their lives. Mitchell's rare, genuine smile punctuated his quiet observation. Perhaps many things you were taught about America and Germany are proving less than accurate. As the evening deepened and the tobacco burned down to glowing embers, the rigidity of Klaus's indoctrination began to erode. The foundational lessons of American barbarism, meticulously drilled into him by the Reich, were daily confronted by a reality that was far more complex and resistant to simple categorization. This was not a landscape of perfection, but one defined by a stubborn insistence on basic human dignity, extended even to those designated as the enemy. The long-held doubt that served as a protective intellectual armor now felt less like a shield and more like the confining bars of a cell, separating him from a nascent desire he could not yet articulate, but which grew more compelling with every passing hour. This period of quiet psychological realignment was shattered, without warning. A September morning, deceptively calm and clear, gave way to violent natural chaos. Klaus, absorbed in an irrigation survey, first registered a distant, ominous rumble, a sound deeper and more sustained than mere thunder. He lifted his gaze from his maps just as a terrifying wall of churning brown water crested the horizon, surging down the usually desiccated creek bed. This torrent was aimed directly toward the camp in the small, vulnerable town of Cedar Springs, 3 miles distant. His navigator's instincts immediately took over, calculating speed and trajectory. "Flood!" he shouted, first in precise English, then in urgent German. The water, thick with debris, tree limbs, shattered fence posts, and what appeared to be the remnants of a barn roof, was demonstrably not the gentle overflow sometimes welcomed by local farmers. Within minutes, Commander Mitchell arrived, summoned by the guards who had heard Klaus's desperate warnings. The commander took one decisive look at the approaching maelstrom and made a choice that defied the established protocols of warfare, a decision that would have been utterly inconceivable within the rigid structure of any German prison Klaus had ever heard described. "I need volunteers," Mitchell announced to the assembled prisoners. "American teams are already moving toward town with sandbags. Anyone who wishes to assist can come with me." The silence that followed profound, punctuated only by the rapid, audible beat of Klaus's own heart. Then the tension broke. Hans, his young face etched with determination despite the slight tremor in his voice, stepped forward. "I go." Slowly, methodically, others followed. First men from Klaus's work detail, then more watching from the barracks. In less than 20 minutes, 37 German prisoners of war were mobilized, loaded onto military trucks alongside their American guards, and raced toward a Texas community whose name most of them could barely pronounce. Cedar Springs was already gripped by chaos upon their arrival. The creek had violently breached its banks, sending a deluge of muddy water surging through Main Street as residents frantically struggled to salvage belongings and move the vulnerable, children, and the elderly to higher ground. Amidst the controlled panic of community fighting for survival, a local civilian, a man in his 50s whose hands were visibly callous from ranch work, approached the convoy with undisguised suspicion. He eyed the truckload of enemy soldiers. "Are you certain of this, Commander?" he challenged Mitchell. These men remained the enemy. Mitchell's jaw visibly tightened, yet his voice remained calm and resolute. "Today," he stated simply, "they are merely men with strong backs who understand how to work." And work they did. Klaus found himself paired with Jim Peterson, a local farmer whose slow, measured drawl spoke of a lifetime spent coaxing life from stubborn Texas soil. They labored side by side, filling sandbags, their communication limited to the necessary commands of shared survival. The initial communication relied primarily on shared exertion and nonverbal cues. Yet, Klaus quickly recognized the farmer Peterson's innate expertise in rural hydrology, a profound ability to anticipate the river's next destructive course and read the subtle shifts in water flow. "You understand rivers," Peterson stated simply during a brief respite, mopping his brow with a faded red bandana. Klaus, recalling years spent observing currents beneath the ocean surface, nodded thoughtfully. "Water follows its own imperative. We can only attempt to suggest an alternative path. Peterson offered a rare, genuine smile in response. The first true indication of warmth Klaus had encountered from an American civilian. By late afternoon, their collaborative effort had yielded a formidable network of sandbag walls, successfully diverting the worst of flood surge away from Cedar Springs' downtown core. Essential homes that were hours from destruction remained dry, and the main thoroughfare stayed viable for the passage of critical emergency vehicles. Klaus labored until his back protested and the rough burlap had shredded his hands raw, driven not by patriotism for a foreign nation, but by a deeper, unnamed compulsion that transcended wartime ideology. A local newspaper photographer documented the scene. German prisoners and American citizens standing shoulder to shoulder, their respective uniforms equally caked in mud, their shared determination etched onto their faces. The following day, the headline proclaimed, "German heroes helped save Cedar Springs." Klaus would preserve this clipping for the remainder of his life, less for the public commendation and more for the profound dissonance he felt regarding the word hero when applied to him by people he had been indoctrinated to regard as enemies. That evening, back within the confines of the camp, Lieutenant Mitchell introduced a crucial new element to Klaus's education, vocational training in navigation for his fellow prisoners. These sessions convened after the evening meal in the mess hall, where Klaus utilized the long wooden tables to spread out detailed maps, demonstrating compass readings, the precise mathematics of triangulation, and the careful art of plotting courses across uncertain terrain. Hans quickly proved an exceptionally astute student, grasping complex concepts that had taken Klaus years of maritime practice to master. Yet, it was the older prisoners who offered the most surprising contributions. Franz Weber, a seasoned former merchant marine who understood commercial shipping routes, and Otto Kellner, a geology professor whose topographical knowledge complemented Klaus's deep-sea experience. After the war, Franz noted one night, while solving a difficult charting problem, there will be immense rebuilding. Germany will require men who can accurately map new infrastructure and plan new cities. Until this moment, Klaus had rarely permitted himself to consider anything beyond simple survival, the war's termination, or the distant hope of reuniting with Anna. But seated in that American mess hall, surrounded by men slowly transitioning from defeated soldiers into students preparing for an indeterminate future, he began to visualize possibilities previously unimaginable. The Nazi depiction of America as an evil empire and the associated claim of the German master race both began to dissolve under the weight of shared experience and mutual labor. Perhaps the world was far more intricate and promising than any government had been willing to concede. This realization was both exhilarating and profoundly frightening, dismantling ideological barriers he had maintained since childhood. If his fundamental beliefs about America were incorrect, what other foundational truths might be flawed? And if former enemies could become collaborative teachers, focused students, and even colleagues, what did that profound shift imply about the conflict they had all endured? Klaus surveyed the mess hall, observing the faces bent diligently over charts and sextants. Weeks had passed since Klaus Weber, a German U-boat officer and prisoner of war, had been granted the rare privilege of administrative duties under Commander Mitchell. This routine, performed while Commander attended a meeting with visiting Red Cross officials, had fostered a dangerous, albeit fragile, sense of trust. Weber was wrestling with an internal expansion of his understanding of his military oath, a loyalty that was beginning to encompass an unexpected, almost respectful connection to his captor, rather than suspicion. The workspace was meticulously ordered. The irrigation maps were exactly where they belonged, and the compass readings had been filed in precise chronological order. But beneath a routine stack of requisition forms lay a concealed anomaly, an envelope sealed with the imposing mark of the War Department. For years of rigid military discipline screamed at Weber to replace the papers immediately, to adhere strictly to the protocol demanded by his rank and situation. Yet a name, his own, visible through the thin government paper, arrested his hand. His movements became involuntary, unfolding the document that would instantly shatter the delicate edifice of professional courtesy and trust he had begun to construct. The subject line was chillingly explicit: intelligence gathering from German Klaus Weber. The subsequent paragraphs detailed the operation in stark, bureaucratic language. Your reports on submarine navigation techniques have been invaluable to naval intelligence. Continue developing relationship with subject. priority information needed, torpedo firing solutions, depth charge evasion tactics, U-boat communication protocols. Weber read the words 3 times before their devastating meaning fully penetrated the shock that numbed his thinking. Every shared cigar, every moment he had interpreted as genuine respect, had been a calculated performance, an elaborate espionage effort designed to harvest crucial military secrets from a prisoner naive enough to believe in American honor. The navigation techniques he had demonstrated with such pride, the stories of life aboard a U-boat, had been meticulously mined by a man who offered Cuban cigars while systematically extracting intelligence that could now be deployed to kill other German sailors. When Commander Mitchell returned an hour later, the atmosphere in the office was cold and absolute. Weber remained seated. The incriminating letter spread before him like irrefutable evidence of profound betrayal. Mitchell paused in the doorway, his face instantly registering the seismic shift in the room. Klaus. His voice carried the cautious tone of a man who recognized imminent danger. Weber rose slowly, his movements controlled despite the incandescent rage boiling beneath his uniform. He picked up the heavy wooden humidor from the desk, the very container that had held the prize Monte Cristos, symbols of what he had foolishly interpreted as genuine friendship. His English fractured under the immense weight of the moment. "You make me believe, make me betray my oath." With a final, violent motion, he hurled the humidor at Mitchell's feet. It struck the wooden floor, shattering instantly. Cuban cigars scattered like broken promises, their rich tobacco spilling across the official documents that were now exposed as the instrument of espionage they had always been. Mitchell did not flinch, nor did he offer a defense. He simply looked at the scattered debris with a grim resignation. Narrator, voiceover, measure authoritative, slightly grave. Mitchell offered quiet explanation, perhaps tinged with genuine regret, but was met by Klaus's eyes, now steady, direct, and filled with a cold fire betrayal. "Explain." Klaus's voice did not just rise. It fractured into a shout of profound anguish, an outburst so raw it instantly drew the running footsteps of guards down the corridor. "Explain how you manufactured traitor, how you systematically stole my trust, not for friendship, but solely for your intelligence reports." The office door burst open as a security detail responded to the commotion, their rifles presented, but momentarily uncertain of the target. With a swift, dismissive gesture, Mitchell waved them back. "Stand down. Everything's under control here." Yet the pretense of order was already shattered. Klaus was marched to solitary confinement, and the confrontation's seismic shock spread through the camp's population with immediate velocity. Prisoners, who had witnessed the humiliation of their former leader, began to whisper, their accusations of collaboration turning Klaus into a pariah. Simultaneously, the American guards, who had allowed themselves a measure of ease and comfort around the German detainees, reverted instantly to suspicion. Every friendly gesture was now scrutinized, every casual interaction viewed as a potential sign of deception. The isolation of the cell offered no respite. When Sofia Martinez arrived with his evening meal, her customary warmth had been replaced by a rigid, professional distance. "Did you know?" Klaus demanded through the meal slot, desperate for confirmation that his own judgment had not been entirely compromised. Sophia hesitated. In that agonizing pause, Klaus found his answer. She had known, or at least harbored deep suspicion, yet had chosen silence while he walked blindly into a meticulously constructed trap. He had been trusting an enemy engaged in a complex, long-term intelligence operation far exceeding his own naivety. The immediate operational consequences were stark. The evening jazz session ceased. The navigation classes, symbols of intellectual engagement and mutual respect, were suspended indefinitely. Even the daily work details devolved from cooperative effort into exercises in mutual suspicion. Klaus had become toxic, a collaborator to his fellow prisoners, and a compromised security risk to the Americans, his temporary utility extinguished by his discovery of the truth. In the sterile confines of his cell, Klaus stared at Anna's letter, the only genuine artifact in a world newly revealed to be built on carefully managed lies. Her words spoke of resilience, of rebuilding their life in a stronger, wiser Germany emerging from the war's ashes. Yet Klaus could no longer envision that future. He could no longer trust his own judgment about anything or anyone. His father's brass compass sat beside his cot, its needle faithfully pointing north, an unwavering beacon of objective truth regardless of the chaos raging in Klaus's heart. The instrument remained perfectly accurate, but Klaus was paralyzed, unable to trust his ability to interpret the emotional terrain that stretched ahead. If he could be so thoroughly deceived about Mitchell's motivations, his internal navigational system was fundamentally broken. The Cuban cigars, he realized with chilling clarity, had been the perfect metaphor. Exotic luxuries offered by captors to prisoners, symbols of false generosity masking a deeply calculated agenda. He had been seduced by the appearance of dignity and respect, failing to recognize that his captivity had simply taken a far more sophisticated and psychologically damaging form than he had ever anticipated. The fragile hope he had nurtured for genuine friendship across enemy lines, for the possibility of honor, was now nothing more than collateral damage of an intelligence failure. Narrator, grave, authoritative tone. The shattered edifice of a future built on reconciliation lay in fragments around him, much like the remnants of the humidor on Mitchell's office floor weeks earlier. 3 weeks into his isolation, the second letter arrived, delivered by a different Red Cross courier. This volunteer approached Klaus's cell with the practiced, clinical detachment reserved for the most difficult political prisoners, sliding the envelope through the meal slot without acknowledging his presence. Even before breaking the seal, Klaus understood this correspondence carried the cruel finality that would extinguish the last flicker of his carefully constructed hope. Anna was dead. She had perished 2 months prior, a casualty of the sustained Allied bombardment of Hamburg. Crucially, her death did not occur during the initial firestorm Klaus had already processed, but in a devastating follow-up strike specifically targeting the improvised refugee camps where survivors had desperately sought shelter. According to the account provided by Anna's sister, she had been aiding injured children when the second wave of bombers struck. The makeshift medical station sustained a direct hit, claiming her life instantly. Klaus's response was a study in mechanical precision. He read the communication once, folded it with ritualistic care, and placed it upon his small table next to his father's navigational compass. There was no eruption of grief, no stabilizing wave of familiar numbness, nor the cathartic release of rage. There was only an absolute vacuum where his future had once been, a void that consumed the very concept of purpose. Following this devastating news, Klaus ceased eating, not by conscious decision, but through profound and complete lack of interest in sustaining a body that no longer served any identifiable function. Within days, the camp guards noted his rapid deterioration, reporting his condition to camp medical authorities, who swiftly recommended force feeding should his self-imposed fast continue. Klaus registered their professional concern as an absurdly touching paradox. Such diligent attention paid to preserving the life of a man who had lost every reason to live. On the 4th day of the silent hunger strike, Commander Mitchell appeared at the cell door, carrying a familiar sight, a new polished wooden box, a replacement humidor. Mitchell settled onto the cold corridor floor, his back against the wall, and withdrew 2 Cuban cigars with the same meticulous attention Klaus recalled from those initial evenings when trust had seemed attainable. "I need to tell you something," Mitchell stated quietly, lighting both cigars. Despite Klaus's rigid silence, the smoke drifted through the steel bars, carrying with it the ghost scent of lost collaboration. Mitchell continued speaking, addressing the wall as much as the prisoner. "Yes, Washington wanted intelligence reports. They ordered me to cultivate a relationship with you, to extract actionable information, specifically concerning submarine tactics, navigation techniques, anything that would advance the war effort." Mitchell drew deeply on his cigar, the ember pulsing red in the dim corridor light. "But I never sent the reports." The words penetrated Klaus's deep apathy slowly, like a sound traveling through deep water. For the first time in weeks, he shifted his gaze toward Mitchell. "I wrote them," Mitchell admitted. "Detailed reports of everything you told me, every technique you demonstrated, every story you shared. Then I filed in my desk drawer and reported to Washington that you were uncooperative, suspicious, and unwilling to discuss technical matters." Klaus sat up slowly, his weakened body protesting the movement. "Why?" For a prolonged moment, Commander Mitchell held the brass and glass instrument, studying its finely etched face. "This compass, Klaus instantly realized, was not merely a tool of navigation, but a mirror reflecting a shared professional language. It signified the profound, unspoken understanding between men who had dedicated their lives to finding direction amidst the brutal uncertainty of terrain and ocean. Mitchell finally broke the silence, his voice measured but heavy with years of unspoken grief. My son perished at Pearl Harbor, 22 years old, consumed by the righteous fury of fighting what he believed was a good fight against existential evil. He paused, allowing the weight of the statement to settle in the confined space of the Texas jail cell. He believed every propaganda narrative about Germans being monsters, just as you, I suspect, internalized a counter-narrative that painted Americans as barbarians. Mitchell slowly raised the glowing tip of his cigar, scrutinizing the ember as if it held the answers to decades of moral ambiguity. He dismissed the stereotype. But you were not a monster, Klaus. You were simply a man striving to execute your duty with honor, to protect your crew, and ultimately, to return home to someone he loved. An impulse identical to that which drove my own boy, and indeed all men caught in the maelstrom of conflict. The emotional armor Klaus had maintained for months, the hardened shell of the defeated U-boat commander, finally fractured under the sustained pressure of recognition. Anna is dead, he stated simply. Mitchell's reply carried the raw, unpolished sorrow of genuine empathy, not the calculated sympathy of an intelligence officer. I know, Sophia informed me. I am truly sorry. The cigars, Klaus pressed, the weight of his perceived transgression heavy in the air. Your father's cigars. I gave them to the enemy. Mitchell offered a surprising, genuine smile. My father's last box, yes. He explained profound significance. He died secure in conviction that Americans conducted warfare with honor, that we were fundamentally distinct from our enemies because we treated prisoners not as obstacles to victory, but as fellow human beings. Mitchell's gaze was steady. I offer them to you because you embody that very honor, even in the crucible of defeat. Klaus accepted the offered cigar, his hands trembling from more than physical exhaustion. As Mitchell carefully lit the Cuban tobacco for him with the same meticulous attention he had displayed that first evening, Klaus felt the protective walls around his heart begin their slow collapse. I betrayed my oath, Klaus whispered, the admission heavy with shame. Mitchell immediately corrected the interpretation, redefining the historical record. You shared specialized knowledge with men who required it to build better lives following the war. You helped preserve an American town from catastrophic flooding. You demonstrated dignity toward your enemies, even when you possessed every justification for hatred. If that is betrayal, then perhaps the world requires more such traitors. Sophia, appearing silently at the corridor's end, carried a tray laden with real food, not the standard rations of confinement, but the unmistakable aroma of home cooking, a testament to her quiet vigilance ensuring his survival. As Klaus drew the rich smoke deep into his lungs, feeling its warmth fill the void, he understood Mitchell's gesture transcended mere intelligence gathering or manipulation. It was an act of profound recognition, one master navigator acknowledging another, a man reaching across the chasm of conflict to affirm the fundamental humanity that war strives so relentlessly to obliterate. Though Germany had formally surrendered weeks prior, news filtering slowly into the Texas camp, Klaus faced the inevitable choice between returning to a ruined homeland or forging a new path. Yet, sitting in that stark jail cell, sharing fine Cuban tobacco with a man who had risked his career to protect Klaus's dignity, he finally grasped that the most critical form of navigation was not charting oceans or battlefields. It was bridging the vast, dangerous distance between declared enemies and the shared ground of humanity.